The day the homeowners association realized they had built a $700,000 swimming pool on land they didn't own, I was standing across the fence holding a cup of coffee and trying very hard not to smile. Kids were already lined up with inflatable rafts. Board members were shaking hands like politicians on election day, and a local photographer was setting up for what was supposed to be a celebration. The only problem was that the pool sitting at the center of all that excitement was bone dry. No water. No opening ceremony. No happy ending. At least not for them. My name is Caleb Mercer, and for almost 15 years I owned a narrow strip of land on the far edge of Ashwood Meadows, a suburban neighborhood about 40 minutes outside Columbus. It wasn't the kind of property people bragged about. No house sat on it. No lake views. No fancy landscaping. It was mostly grass, a gravel service path, and a utility connection I'd installed years earlier when I was considering a small agricultural project. Most people drove past it without even noticing it existed. That was exactly why I bought it. I like quiet investments. Land doesn't complain, doesn't call in sick, and if you're patient enough, it usually becomes more valuable over time. So every year I paid the taxes, maintained the access path, and left it alone. When Ashwood Meadows started expanding, I wasn't particularly concerned. New homes went up. More families moved in. Eventually the neighborhood formed an HOA. At first they seemed harmless enough. They handled landscaping around the entrance, organized holiday decorations, and occasionally sent newsletters full of cheerful announcements nobody actually read. The board changed over time, though. The original volunteers eventually stepped down and were replaced by people who took the job a little too seriously. You know the type. People who suddenly discover a tiny amount of authority and start acting like they're running a small country. The president of the board was a man named Trevor Haskins. Trevor loved two things more than anything else in the world: hearing himself talk and reminding everyone that he was the HOA president. The first time I met him, he spent 15 minutes explaining community values before asking my name. That should have been my first warning. For several years we barely interacted. My land sat near the outer boundary of the development, and since I didn't live inside the neighborhood itself, I mostly stayed off their radar. Then one spring, everything changed. A glossy flyer appeared in mailboxes across the area announcing what Trevor called the future of community living. The project was ambitious. A recreation center, a swimming pool, a pavilion, lounge seating, walking paths, the kind of thing HOA boards love because it looks impressive in newsletters. I actually thought it sounded like a decent idea, until I looked closer. The flyer included a colored site map showing exactly where the project would be built. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at that map for nearly a minute. At first I honestly thought I'd misunderstood what I was seeing. Then I grabbed my survey records from a filing cabinet. Then I compared them side by side. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so ridiculous. The giant blue rectangle representing the future swimming pool wasn't on HOA property. It was sitting directly on my parcel. Every square foot of it. I assumed it was a drafting mistake. Nobody could possibly make a mistake that large and then publish it. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I emailed the HOA. I attached my survey. I highlighted the property lines. I included tax records. I even wrote a polite note explaining that they probably wanted to correct the plans before moving forward. No response. A week passed. Nothing. I sent another email. Nothing. I called the management office. Voicemail. I left messages. No return call. At that point I wasn't angry. Mostly confused. Then one Tuesday morning my confusion disappeared. I was driving past the property when I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the grass. A few days later construction stakes appeared. Then came the excavation equipment. Then the bulldozers. I parked my truck, walked onto the site, and asked one of the workers what was going on. The foreman looked down at his clipboard and said, "Community pool project." I told him he was standing on private property. He frowned, checked the paperwork, then pointed to a site designation stamped across the plans. Community reserve. I looked at that label and immediately understood what had happened. Somewhere inside the HOA's paperwork, somebody had either made a massive mistake or decided my land was easier to take than to purchase. Neither possibility made me feel particularly optimistic. That afternoon, I contacted the county recorder's office. The answer came back exactly as expected. The parcel still belonged to me. No transfers. No easements. No sales. No agreements. Nothing. Legally speaking, every inch remained mine. The strange part wasn't that they were wrong. The strange part was what happened after they learned they were wrong. Because they didn't stop. If anything, they accelerated. And as I sat in my truck watching more equipment arrive the following week, listening to concrete mixers rumble onto land I legally owned, I started realizing something uncomfortable. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a gamble. The HOA was betting that once enough money had been spent, I'd simply walk away. What none of them realized was that buried beneath that property was one detail they had completely overlooked, and before long, that single detail was going to turn their dream project into the most expensive mistake Ashwood Meadows had ever seen. The moment I realized the HOA wasn't slowing down, I stopped trying to convince them and started documenting everything. Every truck that entered the site got photographed. Every new structure got dated and logged. Every email I sent was saved in multiple folders. My attorney, a calm older guy named Richard Boone who had spent 3 decades dealing with property disputes, looked through the file one afternoon and leaned back in his chair. "Caleb," he said, "I've seen people accidentally build fences over property lines. I've seen garages 6 feet over the boundary. I've even seen somebody put half a driveway on the wrong parcel. But I've never seen anyone build an entire recreational facility on land they don't own." I asked what he thought would happen. He smiled and said, "That depends on how stubborn they are." As it turned out, they were extremely stubborn. Summer rolled on, and the project grew larger every week. Concrete was poured. Steel fencing went up. Landscaping crews planted decorative shrubs. The pavilion took shape beside the pool. Every time I drove by, it looked more finished than the day before. What amazed me wasn't the construction itself. It was the confidence. Nobody from the HOA ever contacted me. Nobody asked permission. Nobody attempted to negotiate. Nobody even pretended there was a disagreement. They acted like the land already belonged to them. Meanwhile, residents inside Ashwood Meadows were getting excited. My friend Linda lived 2 streets inside the development and occasionally called with updates. "You should hear Trevor," she told me one evening. "He talks about that pool like he personally built it with his bare hands." Apparently, every board meeting had become a celebration of Trevor's leadership. Property values would rise. Families would be happier. The community would become a destination neighborhood. The project was presented as proof that the HOA board was visionary. That's the funny thing about people who become obsessed with success. Sometimes they stop checking whether the foundation underneath that success is real. Around that time, I decided to walk the property one evening after most workers had left. The sun was dropping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the construction site. That's when I found the detail that would eventually change everything. Near the rear edge of the parcel sat a small metal utility box partially hidden by tall grass. I knew exactly what it was because I'd paid to install it years earlier. Back when I bought the land, I'd hired a contractor to connect a water supply line for future irrigation. The project never happened, but the infrastructure remained. More importantly, the connection was fully permitted and recorded. I unlocked the box and looked down at the valve assembly. Then I followed the newly installed piping leading from the utility connection toward the pool equipment area. I stood there for a moment and actually laughed out loud. Not because I was happy, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They had tied the entire pool system into my water connection, my water line, my utility access point, my infrastructure. Apparently, whoever designed the project assumed the land was community property and never bothered verifying ownership. That single assumption was about to become very expensive. The next morning I called Richard. "You'll want to hear this," I told him. After explaining what I'd found, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, "You're kidding. I wish I was. So let me get this straight. They built the pool on your property and connected it to your utility line." "That's exactly what they did." He laughed so hard I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Well," he finally said, "that changes things." Over the following weeks, we continued gathering documentation. The HOA continued spending money. Banners appeared around the neighborhood announcing a grand opening celebration in early September. Social media posts showed smiling board members touring the facility. Trevor gave interviews to local community pages. One article quoted him calling the pool the crown jewel of Ashwood Meadows. Every time I saw that phrase, I shook my head. The crown jewel was sitting on private property and connected to a water source they didn't control. But I kept quiet. Richard advised me not to interfere with construction. "Let them finish," he said. The more complete the project becomes, the harder it'll be for them to pretend this was a minor mistake. So I waited. Sometimes that's the hardest part. People think revenge is about dramatic action. Most of the time it's about patience. It's about letting someone continue making bad decisions until the consequences become unavoidable. A week before opening day, I received my first direct communication from the HOA in months. Not an apology, not a negotiation request, a violation notice. I wish I were making that up. According to the letter, survey stakes I'd placed along my property line were creating an unattractive appearance visible from community areas. They demanded removal within 10 days. I read the letter 3 times, then drove straight to Richard's office. He nearly fell out of his chair laughing. They built a swimming pool on your land, he said between laughs, and they're upset about survey stakes? The absurdity of it almost made me forget how serious the situation actually was. Almost. Because beneath the comedy sat a deeper issue. The board genuinely believed they were untouchable. Somewhere along the way they'd convinced themselves that authority meant ownership. That if enough people agreed with them, reality would adjust accordingly. It doesn't work that way. Property records don't care about popularity. County maps don't care about speeches. Facts remain facts. 3 days before the grand opening, I made one final visit to the site. The pool looked beautiful, honestly. Crystal blue tiles lined the interior. Fresh concrete surrounded the deck area. New furniture sat neatly arranged beneath umbrellas. Kids riding bicycles slowed down to admire it. For a brief moment, I actually felt bad for the residents. Most of them were innocent. They'd paid HOA dues expecting responsible leadership. They had no idea what was coming. On the evening before opening day, I walked out to the utility box carrying copies of every relevant document. Survey maps, tax records, utility permits, county confirmations. I checked the valve one last time. Then I closed it. Slowly, deliberately, legally. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. No drama, no sabotage, no damage. I simply exercised control over infrastructure that belonged to me. Then I locked the box, returned to my truck, and drove home. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning the weather was perfect. Blue skies, warm temperatures, not a cloud in sight. By 10 o'clock the parking area was packed. Families arrived carrying towels and folding chairs. Music played through portable speakers. Balloons lined the entrance. Volunteers handed out refreshments. Trevor stood near the gate greeting residents like a man preparing to unveil a monument to his own greatness. I parked nearby and watched quietly from a distance. The speeches began. Board members thanked one another. Trevor talked about community investment, shared vision, and building a legacy for future generations. People applauded. Cameras flashed. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Staff members headed toward the pump room to begin filling the pool. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. More minutes passed. Still nothing. At first nobody seemed concerned. Then workers started moving faster. Maintenance personnel disappeared into equipment areas. Radios crackled. Confused expressions spread across faces. The giant pool sitting at the center of the celebration remained completely empty. And as I watched technicians begin tracing water lines back through the property, I realized the exact moment of truth had finally arrived. At first the crowd treated it like a minor delay. People kept chatting, kids kept running around, and Trevor continued smiling for the cameras, even though I could see the confidence starting to crack around the edges. 10 minutes later the mood had changed. 20 minutes later it had changed again. Workers were now moving quickly between the pump room and the equipment shed, speaking in low voices while board members huddled together trying to figure out why the centerpiece of their big day wasn't cooperating. Then one of the maintenance supervisors pointed toward the back of the property and started walking. 2 others followed him. A few minutes later they reached the utility box. My utility box. The same one sitting beyond the fence line, outside HOA property, marked by survey stakes that Trevor had once demanded I remove. I started walking over. By the time I arrived, several board members were already standing there staring down into the box. The valve was closed. The line feeding the entire pool system was inactive. Trevor looked up and saw me approaching with a folder under my arm. His expression changed immediately. "Caleb," he said, forcing a smile. "Maybe you can help us understand what's going on here." I nodded. "Actually, I can." Then I opened the folder. One document at a time, I handed over the survey maps, property records, tax filings, utility permits, and county confirmations we'd spent months organizing. Nobody said much while they looked through them. The maintenance supervisor spoke first. "Wait, this land belongs to him." Nobody answered. A few residents standing nearby leaned closer. Someone asked another question. "Are you saying the pool is on private property?" This time I answered. "Every square foot of it." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument ever could. You could actually watch the realization spread through the crowd. Neighbors looked at board members. Board members looked at Trevor. Trevor looked like a man trying to solve a math problem after discovering he'd been using the wrong formula for 6 months. Finally, he cleared his throat. "There has to be some misunderstanding." I shook my head. "I've been trying to explain it since construction started." His face turned red. "Why didn't you stop this?" I almost laughed. "I sent emails. I mailed documents. I left messages. I talked to your contractors. What exactly would you have liked me to do next? Hire a marching band?" A few people nearby actually chuckled. Trevor did not. Over the following days, the story spread through the neighborhood faster than anything I'd ever seen. Residents demanded answers. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Lawyers became involved. The county opened reviews. Contractors started asking uncomfortable questions about permits and site verification. What had been presented as the HOA's greatest achievement suddenly became its biggest liability. Richard handled most of the legal battles after that. The details stretched on for months, but the outcome was surprisingly simple. The HOA had no ownership rights, no easement, no legal access agreement, no authority to build where they had built. Eventually, they faced 2 choices: remove the project entirely at enormous expense or negotiate. For the first time since the entire mess began, they finally chose to talk. The final settlement remained confidential, but let's just say the number attached to that conversation was dramatically higher than what purchasing the land would have cost in the beginning. A lot higher. Trevor resigned before everything was finished. Several other board members followed. New leadership took over. The residents got their pool. I got compensated fairly. And Ashwood Meadows spent years trying to forget how the whole disaster happened in the first place. Looking back, the strangest part wasn't the money or the legal fight. It was how easily intelligent adults convinced themselves that confidence could replace facts. Nobody on that board woke up one morning planning to create a catastrophe. They simply became so focused on what they wanted that they stopped verifying whether they actually had the right to do it. That's a dangerous habit, whether you're running an HOA, a business, or just your own life. Sometimes the biggest disasters don't start with bad intentions. They start with unchecked assumptions. Every now and then I still drive past that pool. Families are swimming. Kids are laughing. Most residents probably have no idea how close that place came to never opening at all. And honestly, that's fine. Life moves on. But every time I pass the entrance, I remember standing there on opening day, watching hundreds of people stare at an empty pool while the truth slowly surfaced one document at a time. So here's the question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. If you were in my position, would you have shut off the water before opening day, or would you have handled it differently? And if you were one of the residents paying HOA dues, who would you blame most for what happened? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or a situation where common sense somehow disappeared completely. I'd love to hear your perspective, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle.